Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of FreeThought Hour. Now, I have two people connected to me, both of them from South Africa. I've got my regular co-host. Hello, Tercia, how the devil are you?
Angelic as always.
Well, I can't argue with that. And Pieter, come and join us. How the devil are you?
Pleased to meet you, John.
Great. Okay. Now, the show usually starts with our hosts, that's me and Tercia, grilling our guest, asking our guest a little bit about himself, so that we've got some background on you. Now, I know that Tercia is already in your contacts, but I'm not. So can you please tell me and our audience, future audience, we don't have anybody joining us yet, about how you got to be the Pieter Roux that you are today?
Where do you want me to start? It's quite a broad question.
Yes.
So where I am today is I'm formally retired. By the way, tomorrow is my birthday.
Happy birthday!
Yes, indeed.
I'm turning 63 tomorrow. So according to the latest, view on these things, I'm approaching middle age in about 7 years.
Yes.
So I'm considered a young person. So it's probably better to describe me as unemployed than retired. So I went to school and in the Cape Town area, and I went to university to study, of all things, theology. I did a BA degree with the classical languages and things like philosophy and psychology. And then after I graduated, I went to the theological seminary at Stellenbosch University, and I did a theology degree. At that stage, I was already unsure as to whether the ministry was the thing that I was cut out for. So I stayed at university for a bit longer. I did an honors degree in philosophy. I started with a master's degree in philosophy, which didn't work out, and I let that go. And then I started to work. I never worked as a minister in the church, so I went off and started a new career.
Can I pop in there?
Yes.
Because Tercia has given me this wonderful quote from yours, which I don't want to waste. I'm
so glad you're doing that, because if you didn't, I would have.
Do you want to do it? Go ahead, Tercia.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Pieter said that you when we discussed the tonight's program, you said you became the person your minister used to warn you against.
Well, I think I realized I was one of the people my minister warned me against, because I started quite early on in my life, bumping up against authority. I questioned authority because not out of a sense of disrespect, but you can't have authority just because you're an older person or you occupy an important position.
Yes.
You have to be able to justify your views, and
yes.
you have to be able. We all have to be able to account for ourselves.
Yes.
And that's been very important for me from the very beginning. And I was still at school when I became a youth church leader in my local congregation, which is not far down the road from where I live now, after spending most of my life in the north of the country. And it was a difficult time politically. It was a time, I'm now talking the mid-70s, when things were not looking good for South Africa politically. And young people started to question, the basis on which society was built. You know,
Yes.
this idea of apartheid. We
Yes.
can go into that,
Can I pop in again there, because this was
of
the
course.
period. Thank you. This was the period when you were getting some international kickback, particularly in the sports field, when the English cricket team that had a coloured player in it was refused entry to play against your purely white South African team at that time. And I think the outcome
Yeah,
of it was for a boycott from pretty
Oh.
much all the countries, uh, so that
correct. So
you, you were more or less
Because,
isolated on the
because
sport field.
yeah,
I wanted, it's interesting for me to have a conversation with somebody who's 13 years my senior. So I'm a spring chicken compared to you, if you are not yet in middle age. But so when you were middle of apartheid and the struggle, I was a little girl of 7 years old. But
Mm.
and when you were building a career and possibly going to were you drafted? Oh dear, because
sorry. I just heard you say you're a spring chicken.
yes, I'll be 50 in January. So compared to you, I mean, you haven't reached middle age yet. So that what does that make me?
A kid.
A kid. Okay, I'll take it. But what's interesting to me is, so were you drafted? Did you go to the border? That did you live that? Because when I finished my high school was in 1990. That was the last year that there was compulsory drafting, and by
Yes,
then it was only 1 year. But when you
yes,
finished school, it would have been compulsory 2-year draft, and
yes.
many men of your generation would have gone to Southwest Africa, now Namibia, and would have fought in the border war. Did you have to go through that experience too?
Yes, but not directly after school. So,
Okay.
so just to come back to something that John said, with the Basil Oliveira incident to which you refer
Yes.
happened
Yes.
probably very early 70s or late 60s. I can't remember the date. So by the time I came to the end of my school career, South Africa was well into isolation.
Yes.
We were heavily engaged in a war on the northern boundary between Namibia and Angola,
Yes.
and it was costing our economy. It was just a matter of time before the end came for the regime in
Yes.
South
Yes.
Africa. So to answer Tasha's question, I went to university after school, and I then when I completed my studies and I was ordained in the Dutch Reformed Church, um, I went. I had to do 2 years national service, which meant that I was then trained in the army as a chaplain. And
Uh-huh.
I worked as a chaplain, and I was posted as a chaplain, and I did I did work as a chaplain in the so-called operational area, where this war was going on.
Mm.
Um, I literally experienced the end of that conflict. Um, I remember coming back from my duty in the war area, and I think it was the second or third weekend after I got home. My wife and I was watching television early on a Saturday morning, and there were the Cuban and Angolan generals and the East German generals meeting at the officers' mess where I spent 2 months of my life. And so that was the end of that conflict. And so after that, it was clear to me that I was not going to have a career in the church. and I started looking out for a new career, and a little bit more about that. But just to go back to my matric year, I sort of, without having any intention of doing so, I ran into trouble with the elders of my congregation, because as the chairman of the youth organization at the time, I invited the youth branch of a so-called black congregation in the peninsula to join us for an evening church service, and that caused a huge rift in my congregation, with some of the elders wanting to resign, and the minister telling me that I've really embarrassed them no end.
Can I
So
come in here, Pieter and John? For our future audience, I think especially younger people do not have the context. So, Pieter, I'm assuming that you were in the Dutch Reformed Church. That's the
yes,
NGK. Yes. So
yes,
I grew up in the Reformed Church, and John and our audience, I don't think people who did not grow up in those years realized that how much of an influence the church played in our roles. I mean, it was church and state was one thing. We had Christian national education, and there was still at that time. Hello, Esther. Sorry, I have to say hello to my friend Esther. There was very segregation between races, and the thing is, to this day, there's still people who threaten to split the Dutch Reformed Church, because some people feel that there's a branch of the Dutch Reformed Church specifically for colored people and specifically for black people. And after the end of apartheid, there was a number of people who said these 2 or 3 branches now have to come back together again, because the only grounds for this separation was the color of the skin. And I can just imagine Pieter being a total outcast. I mean, that was really rebellious of you to have done that in the 80s.
Yeah.
Can I just say that this racism stuff is very Christian, isn't it?
Well, I'm not so sure about that, because it's also true that the fight apartheid and against racism in South Africa, churches played a very central role in that struggle. And people from my own church, the church that I belonged to at the time, I'm no longer associated with any church, but prominent figures in the church that I grew up in were central figures in bringing apartheid to an end.
Yeah.
So certainly, from my perspective, not so much the church, but church leaders. I mean, if you think of people like Bishop Desmond Tutu,
Yes.
before him, someone by name of Beyers Nudeer, Nicol Smith, who was one of my professors at Stellenbosch, also a very prominent person, Reverend Frank Shikane, who ended up in the ANC administration at some point. So there was this dichotomy that you had
leaders, and then you had the congregation.
Say again?
I said you had leaders who were more enlightened, perhaps some of them, and then you had the congregation who were more bigoted.
They were also the people I mentioned, especially from the Afrikaans churches, they also became outcasts. So they also became outcasts. But from the black churches and the English churches, the Presbyterian Church, the Anglican Church, some of the Pentecostal churches, they were fiercely anti-apartheid. For most of the time.
Can I, while you think of where this is going, can I just bring you a sort of news update? Because you mentioned Desmond Tutu, and his daughter is now an Episcopalian
Okay,
vicar.
it seems as it's going to happen from time to time.
Yes, that doesn't matter. We'll cover while
So,
you're
so
AWOL.
long story short, I think I developed a critical mind
Yes.
early on in my life, and there was nothing. I grew up in a very ordinary, non-political home, but
Yeah.
there was never a sense in our house that there were certain things children should not be allowed to ask. And
Mm.
I think it's so important also when we raise our children is that answers or questions deserve well-reasoned answers. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
raised my daughter like that.
Yes. And nothing should be taboo. There should be no questions that we are not allowed to ask.
Exactly, and the thing is, if the home and the family is not a safe place to ask critical questions, then where is?
Yes. Yes.
And so it was very important for me also to raise my daughter like that. But so obviously I arrived at Stellenbosch with very little understanding of the world.
Mm.
Really, I mean, you don't have a clue how ignorant you are when you arrive as a first year student at university. I mean, you know absolutely nothing.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but so then you start sitting in philosophy classes, and you are being confronted with questions
Yes.
that force you to think and to think critically, and so I developed a very keen interest in philosophy. I also did an honors in philosophy, and the the I would say the subject area that I found most fascinating at the time was the philosophy of science, because in the honors course, one of the modules was an introduction to the philosophy of science,
Yes.
and we looked at modern thinkers like Karl Popper,
Yes.
um, and I think if I have to just single out one
Yes.
philosopher who's
Yes.
had the biggest single influence
Yes.
um, on my thinking, not as a philosopher, but just as a human being and the way in which you approach problems, is
Yes.
Popper. Not only because of the fascinating ideas he had about how do you demarcate between scientific knowledge and knowledge that cannot rise to the level of scientific knowledge, the
Mm.
falsification principle, but also his views on the open society.
Yes.
These were the things that I thought was making the world a modern place. You
Yes.
know,
Absolutely.
and his critique of what he called the poverty of historicism, and just trying to understand the context within which Popper was generating these thoughts, the sort of ideas that were floating around in the
Yes.
world at the time, and many of those ideas haven't died. I mean, you had the three big ideologies of the 20th century, which was Western, the Western open capitalist society,
Yep.
based on the traditions of liberal ideas. Then you had socialism, which entered the scene at the beginning, and you had fascism, you know,
Yes. Yes.
and we think that on the face of it, two of those ideologies collapsed and only one remained standing. But I don't think those ideas have disappeared. I think
No.
they've been alive all the time. And I mean,
Yes. Yes.
we think about modern America as this place where democracy has always been a settled matter, and we forget that there were street battles
Yes.
going on in America in the 1960s around
Yes.
not only social justice, but there were many people who really considered socialism as the big idea of the future. You
Yeah.
know, he's a famous one, a journalist whose name escapes me now, who said, when he, after a visit from Moscow, said, I've seen the future and it works, you know, and that kind of thing. And then this whole damn thing, the whole thing collapsed, you know,
Yes. Yes.
and the problem with things that collapse on a global scale like that is what emerges in the void, you know.
Yes.
Um,
Mm.
and I mean, now in modern days, as we speak, we even see fascism making a return.
As
Yes.
in Donald
Um,
Trump and the new Prime Minister of Italy.
Yes.
And would you say Donald Trump is a fascist?
um, no, I just think he's an idiot. I don't think he rises to the evil of fascism. You know, I think he's just interested in one person on earth, and
Yes.
that's himself. You know,
Yes.
so and
I
in a
think he
sense,
enables. Sorry, Peter, I don't want to I don't want to go down that route, but I think the
yes,
danger of somebody like Donald Trump and somebody like Adolf Hitler and the other master fascists, I think if you dig down, they all just think about themselves, but they become enablers for the true
yes.
fascists.
Well, you
And I
could
think
even
that's what makes somebody like Donald Trump
yeah.
particularly dangerous. He is
No,
an
I mean
idiot,
the,
but I
the
think he's
reason
very
why he's so
dangerous.
the reason why he's so dangerous. Um, One of my sort of favorite cartoonists is Scott Adams. You know, he's the father of Dilbert, and I think you can't survive the corporate world without a very sort of decent dose of Dilbert
I'm
to
familiar
keep
with
your
Dilbert.
feet on the ground. And
Yes.
Scott Adams was criticized quite heavily for trying to decode Donald Trump to Americans, and Americans thought he was trying to be an apologist for Donald Trump, and he said, no, I'm not an apologist. I'm just trying to tell you that on a scale of 10, in terms of the ability to communicate effectively, Donald Trump is off the scale.
Yes.
You can't even rate him. He's a 12 or a 13 on a scale of 10. And if you don't take that serious, you know, you're always going to catch up with him. Um, so, but I think he enables all sorts of radical ideas and people, you know. So, but
But
hopefully hopefully he's off the scene. He
Peter,
also,
I
I
want
think,
to. Sorry, go
no,
ahead.
no, I just want to say, I think we mustn't underestimate his ongoing influence in America. But
Mm.
he also stepped. I think he stepped into a cultural war in America
Yes.
that was on the threshold of breaking out.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and
Well,
he came at a moment when I think America was at its weakest.
yes. Yes.
What
Well, as you said, Peter, earlier on, these ideas, these three challenging political principles, my connection, these
I
three rival policies, fascism, socialism, and capitalism, they've never gone away. They're all there. It's just sometimes they're on the back burner. Sometimes one comes forward. Sometimes another one comes forward, and it's like things go in and out of fashion.
what I want to say about what you said about Donald Trump being an excellent communicator, uh, that is, I don't think it can be disputed. And I'm watching a series on Netflix at the moment about Hitler and his rise to power. Well, it's a 3-hour episode, and what I particularly find interesting is that in this series, there are many fairly long excerpts of real footage of Hitler's actual speeches with the subtitles. And what I find the similarities between the style and even the content of somebody like Donald Trump, and then in
Yes.
South Africa, regrettably, somebody like Julius Malema, who's a populist. And the reason I think, it's my humble hypothesis, that these people are such good communicators is because they absolutely disregard all nuance, all complexity, and they have a very straightforward message that's mostly centered around fear and the other. And
Mm,
and and that, I mean, such a, it's so easy. You don't have to think about that. There's no complexity, there's no nuance. It's
mm.
and why they
Yeah.
are such excellent communicators to the masses,
Mm,
because as human beings, we don't like to deal with the complex. We don't like complexity. It makes us
yeah.
feel very uncomfortable. And to get back to what you said about raising children, I have a nonprofit organization that tries to teach critical thinking skills. And one of the things that I find, besides the thing that you said, there should always be a safe environment. So, and nothing is taboo. You said that, John. And the other thing that I think every child deserves to have the privilege of is to have an adult say, that is a good question, and I don't know the answer.
Yes,
Let's work
absolutely.
out together. Because I think many adults, especially parents and teachers, feel uncomfortable with saying, I don't know, because they might have this belief that it will take away some of their authority.
Yes.
To me, is an absurd notion, because if I listen to somebody and they say, as far as we know, or with the facts, the evidence that we have at the moment, we can
Mm,
deduce this or that, then my
yes.
trust in that person's authority increases.
Yes.
And
Well,
I think we should get comfortable with complexity, nuance, and saying, I don't know,
yes.
John.
Thank you. Well, I think COVID, it did a lot of damage, but one good thing it did was expose scientific thinking to the general public, at least in this country. I don't know what happened elsewhere, but we've had almost nightly explanations by real experts, real scientists, and they have explained to us that there is no black or white solution to this. We don't know what's happening. We have to conduct investigations and wait and see. And people haven't met that, because when they went to school, they were taught science as a load of facts, and it isn't. They weren't taught the method properly. And I'm an ex-science teacher, I should know. and so it comes as a harsh shock to them to realize that scientists don't know. We're discovering, we're doing the experiment.
Yes,
All
yes, and there's some parallels between the two. The theme that Tersha said she wanted to talk to me about, which is this whole debate around climate change and what does science say and what it doesn't say, and COVID actually, and some people are beginning to draw those parallels because the same kind of thinking sort of emerged in that, as you say, you have authority being vested in people, not because they know something useful or they can justify themselves, but the mere fact that they are scientists. And I had many people say to me, but you're not an expert. How can you question these experts? But it's about the methodology. It's about
yes,
wanting people to account for what
yes,
they say, and being able, although you're not a scientist, or although you're not a mathematician, or although you're not a medical doctor, I want my medical doctor to explain to me
mm,
what treatment he's prescribing for me, and I want to understand some of his thinking. in doing
Yeah.
so. And many doctors take exception to that, because they can't deal with somebody questioning what they're doing, not because you distrust them, but just because it's your body, and
It's
you
a
need to
challenge.
understand.
It's a challenge to their professionalism. Well, that again, in this country, that's something that's changing, because a doctor used to be almost worshipped, and people
Yes,
admired their advice as though it was gospel, if I can use that word, and their authority was really high. But then
yes,
Google was invented, and people started to
yes,
put their conditions into Google and imagine
yes,
that they got all sorts of symptoms and
yeah,
diseases, and they
yeah,
realized that this isn't cut and dried. And they went to their doctor and they said, "I've got so and so." And their doctor said, "I'll
yes,
do the diagnosis if you don't mind. I'm the one, I've seen
yeah,
patients. I'm the one
yeah.
with the experience. Let me have a look at you." And
And that's
On
fine, that's fine. And you often hear people say, yes, now that we have Google, if anyone is becoming an expert, and there is an element of that, but there's also the fact that Google now gives me access to material that only used to be accessible to the experts. And I think that's an important distinction we have to make. And so if you say something, I can actually go to the source of what you're quoting, and I can see whether I have the same interpretation. And if I don't, then I can ask you, but why do you understand it in this way and not in this way? And it's not to say that I know better, but
no,
sometimes, so when people say to you, oh, you're now a Google expert. I'm not a Google expert. I'm just able to access information that used to be your preserve. So I can
yes,
read articles in the British Medical Journal, and
yes,
although I don't understand all the statistics, I
it
can
gives
follow the
you,
gist of it. I
yes,
can
it gives
follow
you,
the gist of it,
yeah,
and it gives me enough material to ask
reasonable
and
questions.
to ask useful questions. I was very
And
fortunate. I had a GP before we moved down to Cape Town. Was very open-minded, and he took me for an adult person. And I would consult him about a problem, and he would say, there's no easy answer. And he says,
yeah,
you can read this and this and this article. Go and read and form an opinion, because there's also in medicine very seldom black and white. It's not as
yes,
though doctors know everything.
no,
Hopefully, if they're good doctors, they've been taught a proper diagnostic methodology, you know,
yes,
by way of which they can eliminate things that are not wrong with you, and hopefully
yes,
end up with something that could be wrong with you. But they're not magicians
no,
that you shouldn't question.
no.
can I
And,
can I
and
come
as you
in
say,
here?
there's a new generation of doctors
Yes,
coming in. My
yes,
daughter is a medical doctor, and
uh,
and she told me yesterday how offended she was when she was already well into her medical studies, questioning a dentist about something the dentist want to do, and the dentist said to her, "Look, you stick to medicine, and I'll stick to dentistry." You know, um, so not
I didn't know
everybody is
you could
ready
separate the two.
for that openness. Say again.
Um, I didn't know you could separate the two, because if there's something wrong with my teeth, it's my body, and my body is medicine.
Yeah.
But you segued into to the theme that I suggested when I made contact with you, and I have to put all my cards on the table here. Pieter and I disagree about Jordan Peterson. We've had quite interesting discussions on Facebook about Jordan Peterson. I'll still send you my transcript of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's conversation, because I still think it's fascinating. But I think you must take a drive out to Worcester, and we must discuss that over a couple of bottles of good wine. Not tonight, definitely, and preferably not via the internet. But when I read Pieter's posts about climate change, and that's why I suggested that we talk to Pieter, because I think underlying discussions about COVID, discussions about climate change, to me, there's something that underlies all of that, and that is a more philosophical question. And I would like us to ask. I would like to ask Pieter a few questions about climate change and his thoughts about it. But I would like to put it as the thing that interests me about the debates around science and scientific information is, how does a person who has a BA degree in teaching, for example, how does a person like that, with no particular scientific expertise, or even my husband is a mechanical engineer, I mean, he has an engineering degree, a mechanical engineering degree, but that doesn't mean that he knows about climate science. So what is the methodology for the regular person to judge what information to trust, how to access trustworthy sources, and how to judge sources? To me, that is almost more important than just discussing, are you a climate denier or are you a believer? To me, that's actually what we should dig into. And I often think that many topics are so complex and so complicated, and there are things that we just don't know, that nobody has enough time to really dig into, because the devil is often in the details. And
That's what experts are for.
That's what is for?
Experts.
But now the question is, and that's how do you know who to trust?
Who checks the experts? That's the question.
Well,
other experts. There's a consensus of expertise or not.
You see, that's not because. So yeah, can I ask three questions, and you can perhaps address what I've said now in unpacking those three questions. So the three questions that I have are very direct, and they concern climate change. So, Pieter, I would like to know, do you think that there's a climate crisis? If there is a climate crisis, do you think it's caused by human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels? And perhaps that should have been my second question. Do you think there is data to indicate that we have a crisis, and data to indicate my second question? So I would just like you to unpack for us what you think, and how you went about making up your mind, and maybe your mind isn't made up. So yeah, go for it.
So let me just get it. Your first question is, you're asking me, do I think there is a climate crisis?
Yeah.
The second question?
If there is a climate crisis, so
why do you
think it's caused by human activity?
Right.
And then, how do you interpret the data, and where should one go to find data, and how should one go about interpreting it? So that's basically it. I should have emailed you this beforehand. Sorry.
No. So the third question. So where could an ordinary person get data?
Yeah. And what type of data?
Okay.
Are those fair questions?
Well, I think they're reasonable questions. I can answer the first question easily, but the fact that I'm going to give you a very clear answer doesn't mean there's no scope for discussing the.
Well, Pieter obviously doesn't know me well enough, because my mom would tell him, doesn't matter what he answers, there will be a scope for discussion if I'm involved.
Okay, I'm back. So,
You're back.
so let me start. So I can give you a very easy answer to the first question, but that shouldn't close the door to having a decent discussion about the others, and even about why my answer to the first question is what it is. So if you ask me, is there a climate crisis? The answer is no. There isn't a climate crisis. And it's not me saying this. It's a lot of really respected climate scientists saying this. Okay. But it's an important question, because you can't say that I don't think there's a climate crisis without being labeled a climate denier. And I think that's an unfortunate identification problem. So the question whether the climate is changing is not identical to the question, is there a climate crisis?
Absolutely,
Okay, so
I agree.
So that's a very important question, but you can't, in the context that we're dealing with here, you can't say there's no climate crisis. That defines you. By saying there is no climate crisis, it by definition defines you as a climate denier, because the two questions have become identical.
Pieter, can I ask you
So
something?
climate change is no longer about the science of climate and how the climate is changing over time. It's not about that. It's about the crisis.
Pieter, can I
And
ask you?
I think that's very important. Yeah.
So what you're basically saying is that framing it as a climate crisis is already framing it. So using the word crisis is already framing
Yes.
it. Okay, that's
to frame it as a crisis is a moral judgment. It's not a scientific fact. Because science cannot make value. Empirical science is not a value. It's not a value proposition. Empirical science is about the formulation of a hypothesis and the falsification of that hypothesis. That is what Karl Popper meant when he postulated what he calls the demarcation principle between what can count as scientific knowledge and what cannot count as scientific knowledge. So he said,
can I ask you, Pieter, can I ask you another question?
Falsifiable hypothesis. So Popper said only falsifiable hypotheses can lead to a scientific understanding of things, or call it broadly scientific knowledge. But to make postulations that cannot be falsified is a process which Popper said cannot lead to scientific understanding and insight. It can lead to other forms of, call it knowledge or wisdom, but it cannot lead to scientific knowledge. John?
Can we drill down then? I see where you're coming from with your distinction between crisis and actual knowledge. Crisis is a framing in a journalistic way, and that's the sort of thing that's not done by scientists. Scientists say the evidence indicates, and they end it there. And then the politicians or the businessmen come in and make the decision of how we should respond. So, yes, I can see your fine distinction there. But do you think that the climate is changing in an unprecedented way recently?
Scientists say no. There are scientists who...
Well, you can always find some scientists who will say anything. There's always the renegade, the rebel scientist who will come up with the the non-mainstream view. But the mainstream view,
Okay,
and
sorry, it broke down again, so I lost you when you started your question.
Yes.
So
yes.
I disappeared again. So you can't see me disappear.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Oh, okay.
But
so when I disappear, you must know that I'm no longer part of the conversation.
I understand. But I'm also mindful that you're not the only audience. We've
Okay,
got
sure.
other people
But you'll just
who
have
don't
to
want to
repeat
see a black
what you
screen.
said. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So what I said was, do you consider the climate to recently be changing in an unusual way?
So if you look at the scientific evidence, we understand, or let me say, scientists understand the most recent past climate to a degree, and they understand the paleoclimate to a lesser degree.
Pieter, this is now Pieter. Sorry, when you say recent, I've actually I've done a lot of preparation for tonight's discussion because it's not a topic that I know that much of. So recent. If I say recent, I mean recent in geological time. I don't. So we're looking at, well, I don't suppose 10,000 years is geological time, but so what I've been able to establish is that most scientists agree that over the past 10,000 to 15,000 years, the changes in climate that we see now is faster and at a greater pace, and the levels of increase in temperature is greater than we've ever seen in the recent in about 10,000 years. So that's so let's define recent.
Okay, so let's talk about recent in terms of where more or less reliable records exist of human observation. So can we agree that? And then we even talk about 10,000 years ago as part of the paleoclimate. Okay, because
but
nobody was taking notes 10,000 years ago. But
we do have notes about the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, for example. If you look at ice cores,
you can extract ice cores, and there were many times in the past when the CO2 levels were 1,000 times higher than today, and that is not in dispute.
Not in the past 250 or so thousand years. I mean, if you talk so now this is what my initial point was. So now we get to a point in talking about this, and whether we talk about COVID or climate change, we get to a point where I've seen graphs that show that there's now, in the past 50,000 years, we haven't had as much CO2 in the atmosphere. In the deep past, I mean, I'm talking about millions of years. Yes, but before, in fact, the last time there was as much CO2 in the atmosphere as there is now was, or more, not when there was more. It was when there was when I think it's when there was just very primitive life forms on Earth.
Yes.
Well, there was a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere before. But what happened is during the so-called Carboniferous era, which was the time during which shellfish and mollusks and things exploded on the planet, and that in itself led to an incredible sink of carbon, which is the calcification of those animals, where immense amounts of carbon has been sunk into the.
Well, I disagree there, because the Carboniferous period was when plants arrived, and the era of shelled animals was much later, in the Cretaceous period.
Yeah, and it's
So
it's a
sorry,
known
I
fact.
missed. I dropped off again. So
Yeah.
you see, we can discuss. Has CO2 been higher or lower for the whole evening, and then we can take the next subject of the temperature, and we can discuss that for a whole evening. And I want to come back to your earlier question. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not a paleo scientist. I'm not an atmosphere physicist. But what I want, and I expect reasonable answers from scientists who proclaim a climate crisis, is let's look at something that is not in dispute. 10,000 years ago, North America, as far south as Boston, where Boston is today, was covered under the Laurentian ice shelf, which was a 3 kilometers deep ice shelf. And most of Europe was covered in an ice shelf.
Yep.
And that was during the glaciation period of an ice age, which persists to this day. So these things are not controversial. You can Google, you can go and read articles about the ice age that we are in. We are in the Quaternary ice age. And the
Yes.
definition of an ice age, the technical definition of an ice age, is
Mm.
when at least one continent on the planet is covered under ice. Okay.
Yes.
But to
And
me,
so
that's not a
you've got
relevant
an ice
issue.
shelf of more than 3 kilometers on Antarctica. Okay. So 10,000 years ago, there was North America was covered in an ice shelf. Okay. That ice melted. And here's an anecdote. I'm planning to go to the Kalahari Nature Reserve sometime next year. I've never been there. I'm reading a book about the Kalahari and how it formed geologically. Where does that desert come from? Because the so-called Kalahari Basin is the biggest desert on the planet. It runs from the north of South Africa to the northwest Africa,
Mm.
almost into the Sahara Desert.
Mm.
And it wasn't always filled with sand. Okay. It
Mm.
became filled with sand 10,000 years ago when the ice shelves on the European continent and the North American continent started melting. And that caused upheavals in the weather. And this is what the geologists say, where winds of up to 1,100 kilometers an hour were blowing
I'm
over
sorry,
the
Peter,
plains
I'm
of
so sorry.
Africa.
I have to interrupt you. Sorry,
Yeah.
John, and sorry, Peter. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and
Yes.
it's very interesting. A bit, but so John is very strict about the time. So Peter,
Yes.
so I'm blaming. So I'm passing the buck. You see,
Yes.
Yes.
I agree. I think we're all in agreement that what you say about 10,000 years ago. But the point that I think climate scientists, the way I read them, is making is that the ice shelves that have been in existence for the past 10,000 years and that have varied
Mm. Yep.
over the past 10,000 years, the
Mhm.
variations that we see now in terms of the melting is happening at an escalated pace. And
Yes.
Well,
the way that
there's no place where an ice shelf 3 kilometers deep is melting at the moment at
Well,
such a
no,
pace that it's causing weather upheavals. It's as
but
simple as
but
that. It doesn't
but but
exist.
but 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 but, but only
So, but
today.
we don't have to go. We don't have to go back 10,000 years.
Good,
You
good,
can
because
go
I don't
back.
want to.
You can
Only
go back.
today.
You
Only
can go back.
only today.
You can go
Only
back to the 1930s. Go back to the 1930s, and there's a lot
yes,
of weather data for the United States. Okay,
yes,
so you go back to the 1930s, late 20s, 1930s, even up to the 1950s. It was a period of
yes, it,
terrible natural
yes,
disasters for America. So,
yes.
but let's talk about things about which there is no dispute
Okay.
in the science. Okay, so and there's no dispute in science that carbon dioxide levels are rising. Okay.
Okay. Mm.
The first scientist who described it comprehensively was Keeling. So they talk about the Keeling curve, and so that is not a surprise to science. It's been known for a long time, and it's not controversial. It's not in dispute that carbon dioxide levels are rising. It's
Correct.
also not in dispute. It's also not in dispute that since the end or since the beginning of the so-called Industrial Revolution, so around about 1850,
Yep.
and now,
Yep.
the average temperature of the planet has risen by anywhere between 0.9 to 1.2. So let's say
Mm-hmm.
it's risen somewhere between 1 degree and 1.5 degrees. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
There's consensus about that. No, I haven't found a single scientist disputing that.
No. It would be foolish to
Okay.
go against the data. It's well recorded.
So it's well recorded. But what transpired before 1850, and this is where the consensus breaks down. Because before 1950, there was what was known as a Little Ice Age.
You mean 1850?
1850.
Yeah.
So you could also talk about 1850 as the end of the the Little Ice Age.
Mm-hmm.
And the Little Ice Age was preceded by a short period of 100 or so years, which was referred to as the medieval warm period.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So if you look at proxy data available for those periods, what we're seeing at the moment is a return of temperatures. If you plot a long-term curve, is a rising of temperatures back to that point where they were before the Little Ice Age. So we're talking about long-term oscillations. We even talking, and I'm prepared to step anyone through the available data.
Well, yes,
We're looking at a period between 1998 and the present, where the warming trend is statistically insignificant.
well, nobody's disputing the fact that climate has changed since time immemorial.
Exactly. Yes.
Gone up and gone down. But what has happened in the last 150, 200 years is an enormous digging up of what should be buried. You talked about the Carboniferous period. That's when the carbon that had previously been in the atmosphere was captured in the bodies of plants by photosynthesis, and their bodies subsequently got buried by one means or another. They either sank to the bottom of the sea and got sediment fall on top of them, or their forests got blown over or volcanized or something, and all of this previously atmospheric carbon dioxide now in the bodies of plants got buried. What we've done that has never happened before is dug it up and burned it.
Yes, but there is as we speak. So we also have to talk about the heat transfer between the surface and the earth. The heat flux.
Yeah.
And we can there's good science around that, and it's complex. It's
Sure.
not sort of Sunday afternoon reading material, but it is possible to understand.
It's about radiant energy arriving from the sun in short waves, hitting the earth, bouncing off in long waves, having a resonant frequency that makes the carbon dioxide molecules vibrate. That's more energy. You've now got more energy in the atmosphere, more storms.
So,
but
there's
to
no
me it's
so yes. So that's an interesting point you make. So what I've done, and I'm not the first person to do it, I shouldn't even be sitting here explaining these things, because there are scientists who can explain it. But in order to satisfy myself that those people aren't lying to me, so you start reading the IPCC's sixth assessment report, and you start where everybody starts, by reading the summary for policymakers. And that's where most people stop reading. Okay. And then you cross-refer statements made in the policy for summary for policymakers, and you go to the technical annexures. So where, for example, tropical storms are discussed, and they say tropical storms are going to increase. But when you go to the technical annexures, there's weak confidence that there is a signal in the frequency or intensity of tropical storms. And you can take all these things one by one. And someone asked me about tropical storms, and I actually...
Interesting. While Pieter is gone, about tropical storms, some of the data that I've studied actually says that the severity and the frequency of tropical storms will decrease because of the heating. So the storms that do come will be more severe, but they will be fewer, and they will be because some of the heating is because in the northern latitudes, there's not such a big difference between the hot and the cold air because of the warming effect. So there will be fewer storms that are strong, and the strength of the currents is less, but the ones that do grow will grow bigger than the ones that we've had before. So that
sounds like more storms to me, or bigger storms.
But
I want we are running out of time.
We're running out of time. I knew this was going to happen.
You see, it's not happening. The media says it's happening, but it's not happening. What is happening is that every weather event on the planet now gets reported 24/7 on news media. But you can't do science on that basis. You have to go to the actual data. And when you go to the actual data, there's no signal in the intensity or frequency of storms. There's no signal in the intensity or friction or frequency of heat waves. There's no signal in the intensity and frequency of forest fires and things like that. And this is not what I'm saying. This is what the IPCC says. If you might do the trouble of not reading the policy, the summary, which is written by bureaucrats, but you go and read the scientific annexures, and you read it using the language that the IPC has developed to make sense of scientific concepts. So how do you explain something like standard deviation to a non-scientist? How do you explain confidence levels because all these things talk about confidence levels. So here's one thing. I'm just going to give you the short example. So so they say that approximately 1% of the heat flux at the surface is caused by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the greenhouse effect is also an effect that it's more complicated than just how much carbon dioxide there is. There are other factors. So 1% of the heat flux. This is scientifically not controversial. You can check this with an atmosphere physicist. So about 1% of the heat flux at the surface is caused by CO2 in the atmosphere, and then the IPC says most of that carbon dioxide is put there by humans. And they make that claim with a high level of confidence. Okay, so about the 1%. Okay. But then they say there's not a high level of confidence about understanding the 99%. But if your high level of confidence for the 1% is to make any statistical sense, your confidence about the 99% that is caused by other factors has to be better than that. Because if not, then what you claim to be a significant deviation is statistically nonsensical. So if you talk about standard deviation, whether it's in any research, it means that there's an error margin in what you understand. And if what you observe is outside that error, made a valid observation. But if what you've observed is inside the band of uncertainty in the standard deviation, you can't say you've made a valid observation, because you don't know whether you've made a calculation error, whether it's just how it is. There are limits to the accuracy by which we can measure things, and that goes for temperature, by the way. But it also goes to the accuracy with which scientists can formulate hypotheses. And so you have these things are explained in the IP. The terminology they use are explained, and when you read their stuff, you have to refer to that terminology to ask yourself what it means. And we don't have time, but I can step you just through a practical example using tropical storms, where a claim is made in the summary which is not supported in the scientific annexure. It's
Okay, so
only
Pieter,
valid. It's only supported in the scientific annexure if you take the worst case scenario,
okay, so
Well,
but
what you're
not the most
saying,
likely scenario. So
what you're
you see,
saying
it
is,
becomes very technical. It's not an easy discussion. My frustration is that the scientists who know this are not talking about it. They're not
well, it's
prepared they're not prepared, unless they are unattached to a research institution or to a university. They're not prepared to talk about it, because they can literally lose their jobs. And
so what you're saying,
there's ample example for that. And
so Pieter,
I shouldn't be the person.
what you're saying is that the policymakers are not reflecting the facts correctly, and then the question, so that's what I'm hearing you say. And the question that comes to my mind then is, what motive would the policymakers have to not reflect the data correctly? And well, we passed our time, so
yeah.
John will have to call. But I think that's a question that needs to be addressed.
Yes.
However, our listeners choose to do that. But that to me is important, because now, why would somebody want to do that? What would their motive be? And then we're sort of moving into conspiracy theory, don't you think? Because now we're saying that there's
You
some.
don't need conspiracy theories at all. You don't need we are herd animals, and we like the fact that everybody agrees with us. There's no fun in being an outlier. There's no fun in being a contrarian. You can ask these people. You can ask someone like Judith Curry, who lost her tenure at the University of Georgia. You can ask them what it's like to question the consensus. You can go to the.
Well, I'm an
I
atheist
wish
in
we'd
South Africa.
started
I'm an
talking
atheist
about
teacher in
this.
South Africa, so I know exactly what it's like to be an outlier.
Yeah, so I mean, we can talk about this for another hour. You're welcome to invite me back, and then I can, we can go through some of the sources. But you can go to the proceedings of the American Physical Society in 2014, when they were confronted by members of their society who are physicists, obviously, about the climate statement they published, where they endorsed a climate statement suggested by the IPCC, wherein they say that the evidence for human-caused climate change is incontrovertible. And You know, there were Nobel laureates in that association who wanted to resign unless they retract that statement. You can go and read that those proceedings. There's a verbatim of a symposium they held. They drew up a scoping document, which they then posed to 6 climate scientists. 3 of them support the so-called consensus, and 3 of them question the consensus. So each one of those 6 scientists had an opportunity to respond to the scoping document, and they published a verbatim of that symposium. The ultimate outcome of that thing 2 years later was that they archived their climate statement.
Well, I'm mindful of the time, and we really overrun. And what I would love to do would be to get Pieter Hadfield, who's got a website called Potholer54, who really knows how to analyze data and various claims. I'd love to get him to be a guest on this show. Potholer54.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Pieter Hadfield, Potholer54, he goes by, and that's his website. And he is fantastic at analyzing data, demonstrating the factual nature or otherwise of various propositions and claims. So I'd love to get him to be a guest on this show. Maybe at that point we could get you back as well, Pieter, and perhaps you could both prepare some presentation explaining your viewpoints, because we can't do it in an hour of chat, can we?
No, we can't.
But you see, it's quite frustrating for me to sit here and try to argue the case that scientists should be doing. What I can do is I can just repeat questions that have been asked by the American Physical Society and by many others to say, you know, until you provide satisfactory empirical data-based answers to these questions, you know, we wait. What I say to people nowadays is just, you know, how has the changing climate affected your life in an adverse way?
Well, now that's a bit of
that's the wrong question to ask.
It depends who you ask.
Because if there's a crisis, if there's an existential crisis, you would know about it.
Well, there is the people in the low-lying islands in the Pacific. They're having to evacuate because the sea level
Some of them are volcanic islands that rise and sink.
Well, we're not talking about their origin now. We're talking about the water level.
One of the things I actually had on my screen, you know, in case we get that far, is a presentation by Professor Carl Wunsch. You can Google him. He's the doyen of oceanography, and I could have read you the last slide of his presentation on what the status of oceanography is with regarding to accurately measuring the level of the ocean, and B, predicting the future outside of the few millimeters per decade that it's rising.
Does he say anything about acidification?
Say again?
Does he say anything about ocean acidification?
This presentation that he gave was specifically about the sea level rise.
Can we get him on? Well, I want to say...
I'll get Pieter's references and I'll see if I can get those people for us.
Great. Okay, excellent. Well, I want to say, because we've run over time, and I'm mindful of the audience and our future guests who will not wish to be misled by agreeing to come on for an hour and ending up being trapped for longer. So I'm going to say next week, we've got Linda Russell, who's got an interesting story to tell. And she's just recently messaged me to say that she's gone to the Cayman Islands, and on a journey she got sick. So we're hoping that she's going to be well enough to come and join us next week. But finally, thank you very much, Pieter. Thank you, Tercia. Thank you, viewers. Here is the outro. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.